Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here at the Midtown Scholar, and great to have Professor Jason Stanley with us here in Central Pennsylvania. Welcome to our Commonwealth, and it's great to celebrate the publication of this exceptional, very sobering, and quite inspiring, ultimately, book, Erasing History. So, I do want to get to the book, but first I want to start, actually, if you don't mind, with your previous, or with one of your earlier books, with How Fascism Works. So, How Fascism Works came out in 2018, and, of course, fascism was a word that was in the air at the time and continues to be. And rather than sort of consider whether, the various movements and, right-wing movements that we were seeing were or were not fascist, you sort of just dissected what fascism was and what it did and how we could recognize it. So I'm wondering if you could actually just start there with what it is, because it's also an important word in this book.
So let me first address, first of all, it's really an honor to be at Midtown Books. This is a remarkable place, kind of unique. And, so it's a real honor. I mean, these are democratic institutions, bookstores, like libraries, So How Fascism Works is really about the rhetoric and ideology of fascism. The notions of hierarchy, dominant group victimhood, sexual anxiety, like talking about LGBT as threatening your children, the rural-urban divide, the attack on labor unions, attack on Marxism, painting anything that's democratic as Marxist, and the construction of a mythic past to which we must return. So that book is like the ideological structure of fascism. It's really about rhetoric. It's really about how people talk about the world. But I'm a philosopher of language, and I don't believe that you can separate the way people talk about the world from other kinds of practices. So it's not like speech practices can be completely separated from how you behave. In other ways, speech is a kind of behavior. So if people are speaking that way, then you can kind of predict what they're going to do. That's why it was easy to see that a coup would happen. So people were like, oh, he's just talking. But that's like rarely true. and so when you get used to talking about the world, you get used to talking about people like vermin, then eventually you're going to treat them like vermin. So this book is about the educational practices of fascism. Because I faced a puzzle when we saw in the United States the rise of, say, DeSantis and at any rate, the core element of education in this American far-right movement. And I asked myself, why are these attacks on democracy and voting, why are they always accompanied quite centrally with attacks on schools and universities?
It's one of the critical questions, and I guess I'm curious, in between, of course, the publication of How Fascism Works and your new book, a lot has happened, right? In 2018, Donald Trump was president. Then 2 years later, we experienced the largest, global pandemic in many years. 1 million Americans ultimately, have died so far. We experienced a major uprising following the murder of George Floyd in virtually every city and small town in the United States, in some ways questioning fundamental tenets about policing, prisons, the nature of the economy. We have massive social spending, a tremendous amount. And so I'm curious, a lot that interposed in a way between the publication of How Fascism Works and Erasing History. How do you, what role does that sort of experience play in your book and in your current book, and to what extent did it motivate the writing of this book?
Here's how I think about the relationship between, say, Black Lives Matter and Germany in the early 30s and late 20s. There were pitched battles on the street, actual battles between fascists and communists. they were used, but they were sort of set off by fascists, and the fascists promised that they would create law and order and eliminate all protests and all. But those were violent. This wasn't violent, but you get the far right, I mean the Trump MAGA Republicans, speaking of these nonviolent protests and rebellions, speaking of them as if they're the communist rebellions in Weimar Republic. And when they do that, when people are like, we're going to impose law and order, that's reminiscent of what the fascist Nazis promised. So that's one point, that when you look for fascism, you look for an excuse that fascist parties give to cut down, to like seize power, use the military to essentially turn against democracy, invoke the Insurrection Act. So like you can see the Reichstag fire moment. The communists burned down. A communist burned down the Reichstag. So we need to end democracy and target. So that's part of it. Another part of it is the basis in American history. One of my students at Yale once asked me, Professor Stanley, I don't remember in which backlash this occurred, but he said, Professor Stanley, ever since I was born, it's been like a police killing, then a rebellion against the structure, and then everyone agrees they're going to do something about it, and then there's a backlash and it just gets worse. What's going on with that? And I was like, yeah, that is a practice that structures history. The historian Elizabeth Hinton, in her brilliant book America on Fire, calls that the cycle. You get the police, and she shows that cycle existed, from the 60s to the 70s in all sorts of small towns in America, not just Detroit, not just Harlem, but in like Cairo, Illinois. So I think we have a repetition of the cycle falling into a kind of classic kind of fascist politics, which is going to use that cycle against democracy.
And so, but this takes the role, as you examine in your book, and there's a quote here, that you say, truly understanding fascism's success, however, requires discerning not just how it operates and seizes power, but how it achieves legitimacy. And so thus we turn to schools and education. Why is schools? Why is education? Why is that important to the legitimacy of the fascist enterprise?
So Vladimir Putin endorsed my book a few months ago. He said,
"Did you accept it? Is it on your?
I did.
Did you put it on the blur?
It's the beginning of one of the chapters. He said, "Wars are won by teachers." So the book, we've been talking about the United States, but this book, like How Fascism Works, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at, I'm a philosopher, not a historian, as historians repeatedly point out to me. As a philosopher, the generalizations are what we look for in different societies, and then what I do is I usually fit the United States into that. It's another example, like Hungary, for example, and this kind of there are particular ways in which authoritarianism manipulates the past in order to further its goals. Let me give two short examples, not from the U.S. Russian textbooks. Russian textbooks represent there being no independent history of Ukraine. So Ukraine doesn't exist. There's just, it was Russia, and now some crazy people are saying it's something else. And they erase the history of the Russian genocide in Ukraine, Holodomor, in 1930s. And then they represent every Russian aggressive incursion into a neighboring country as helping independence movements in secessions. And so that's why Vladimir Putin says wars are won by teachers, because you're going to think, who are these crazy Ukrainians, the people who call themselves Ukrainian? It's just an anti-Russian identity, which is what Putin said. So that's a very clear example. There are other very clear examples. India is a very clear example. The textbooks under BJP, I won't go into the details, but they're trying to sell Gandhi as slowly as a traitor, and then Turkey. And the United States, of course, very clearly in the Jim Crow era, I talk about like the Virginia textbooks in the early 1960s saying, the slaves were neither as unhappy as the Northerners thought nor as happy as the Southerners thought. And, but, going all the way up into, so these, what I'm trying to do is figure out what are the patterns that are anti-democratic patterns.
Just on that Virginia textbook, that's not, that, of course, they published those during the Jim Crow era, but as you note, there are some recent revisions to curricula where that sounds fairly reminiscent.
Absolutely. For example, in Florida, you're not allowed to teach the Black Lives Matter movement, what happened in 2020. You're not allowed to teach that social movement. People might not realize, but teachers and professors in states like Florida, now Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, are terrified. They're undergoing a horrific authoritarian attack on what they do. And so you asked what happened between how fascism works and this. There was the attack on critical race theory. There were by Christopher Rufo. There was the attack on gender. There was the international attack on LGBT perspectives that came here in Florida. Think about or let's just take Moms for Liberty. Like Moms for Liberty says, we want to be able to intervene in schools to make sure our kids aren't made uncomfortable. But think about if you're the child of same-sex parents, or you're a child who's LGBT, then you're an LGBT person. How are you going to feel when your perspective is not allowed? It's not like a same-sex couple can say, we don't like all the heterosexual representations, right? That's not going to work. So black parents, indigenous parents can't be like, we want the white people taken out. We don't want them to be normative. So what does the liberty in Moms for Liberty mean? It means white heterosexual supremacy. Toni Morrison makes this point that very often liberty and freedom in the United States only makes sense when contrasted with a black unfreedom. So this is what we're seeing. It's the universities, Florida, there are these cookie cutter bills that are passing in state after state, and they're designed to sort of hide what's happening. So Florida passed a post-tenure review, which has conditions like maintaining ideological diversity in the classroom. And in the new post-tenure review, the first post-tenure review happened several years later, and almost 20% of University of Florida professors failed. So tenure has been, so presumably they're going to, I think they're losing their jobs. So Ohio passed that, University of Indiana passed that. So University of Indiana and Ohio State are two of the greatest public university systems in the world, and universities in the world. So it's so bad out there. And that really extreme attack on the educational system, which I think was less envisageable than, say, the attack on the courts that we saw, made me it was like a puzzle for me. Why is this so central? And why is it so, like, horrifying?
Yeah, I mean, it really happened in the space of a very short period of time. I'll just say, it was, as someone who studied critical race theory just in graduate school, it was shocking suddenly to think of this sudden one, because it just felt like a fairly obscure topic, and then suddenly everyone was talking about it, and it became the subject of this very successful attack, largely on on black studies. And
there's a couple things going on specifically with the attack on critical race theory. First of all, it's an attack on the expression critical race theory. As Christopher Rufo said, I'm not the one who called it critical race theory, because without knowing what it is, it sounds scary. And it's reminiscent of the old conspiracy theory that Jews are convincing black people to create into a race war, right? And then it fits the whole narrative, like Marcuse is Angela Davis's professor, so critical race theory evokes this sort of conspiracy theory. But secondly, critical race theory, it's really a home run, because critical race theory just is black history. Critical race theory is the study of structures that maintain racial inequality independently, because they were originally conceived at racist times. But then even when explicit racism goes, you still have the structures in place. So Hinton's work in America on Fire is about police structures, policing that keep, the way police function in segregated cities, like New Haven, where I live, to maintain racial hierarchies. Mortgages and redlining. That's a study. That's critical race theory. So, I recently met, I'm blanking on her name, but a woman who did critical Palestinian studies. She was looking at the legal frameworks that tilted the land ownership to Jews rather than Palestinians, non-Jewish Palestinians. So it's the study of those structures. So critical race theory, so it's both a scary label, and you can get at black history, because if anyone teaches mortgage and redlining, it's critical race theory.
You mentioned India earlier. I'm Indian, born here, but from families from South India, and I followed Indian politics fairly closely because much of my family's there. And one of the things that critics of the current government or the ruling party have been called is anti-national. So when you start criticizing India, you start criticizing what's happening in a particular way, you're called an anti-national. And it became this proud thing for many people, who were critics of the government. They would have their Twitter handles, and they'd say anti-national. And there were shirts that were, because you were like, oh no, I'm a proud nationalist. And so one of the things you talk about in your book is the concept of nationalism as a kind, and it's that, and how nationalism, is a way of conducting an assault on history and what have you. And specifically, you come up with a term called supremacist nationalism. I'm wondering if you could talk about what that is and what makes that distinct.
I didn't realize you followed Indian politics. I think of you as so right. So Indian politics, yes. Let me begin by saying what they're doing in India strategically. They're the Hindu nationalists. The original Hindu nationalist theorist in the 30s, what was his name? I'm blanking on his name again. Savarkar?
Savarkar, yeah.
Savarkar was, look at the Nazis, what they're doing with Jews. We should do that with Muslims. They're explicitly modeling themselves on the Nazis. And they've taken over. Modi was the head of Gujarat, was the prime minister of Gujarat during the Gujarat pogrom, when he let the Hindus go wilding against Muslims, killing thousands, and then he becomes head of India. Now, what BJP does is they conceal their supremacy. So I make a distinction in the book between anti-colonial nationalism and supremacist nationalism. What you have with Hindu nationalism is supremacist nationalism, sort of the clearest, Israel and India might have the clearest examples of supremacist nationalism around right now, and Russian nationalism, those. But in India, they say Muslims are invaders. Muslims are imperialists. India was a pure Hindu nation, and so Muslims are imperialists and the colonizers, and they have to drive the colonizers out. And they're really immigrants. The 200 million Muslims, Indians, they're really immigrants from Bangladesh or something, and they need to be driven out. And so the Hindu nationalists are anti-colonialists because Muslims are so they're cloaking. And anytime you come in to criticize them, like anytime I used to tweet about Hindu nationalism, I'd get like, "You white colonialist Western," and I'm like, you guys like imitate the Nazis. So if I'm not mistaken, we're pretty Western. So that's anti-colonial. That's supremacist nationalism masking as anti-colonial nationalism. These two kinds of. So I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine in the last year, in Ukraine during wartime. And Ukraine is has an extremely democratic civil society. I taught, essentially, Erasing History began in my course in Kyiv in August 2023, which was called Colonialism and Fascism, that course. And then when I came back to Ukraine to teach another course this May, the people in that course, there are hundreds of people in the course, but all the young people were all like the leading journalists. And so the conversation about colonialism and nationalism had been, it wasn't me, it was already, my New York Times did a profile of Miriam Naim, who was my teaching assistant at the time. And this discussion of what kind of nationalism should we have now and after we win? And so this is just a huge public discussion there where people are like, it can't be that after the war, we end up with this supremacist form of nationalism, when now we're like defending LGBT rights and inclusion. And so during wartime, you need nationalism. A point Fanon made. Ukrainians need nationalism now, but it's got to be the right kind of nationalism so it can transform and not become a kind of supremacist nationalism like we find in Israel, like we find in India.
That is extremely fascinating. I mean, in particular, just that debate is already taking place right now and taking place, amongst in a very charged context. That question kind of comes up in American politics as well. It's just, of course, often people who are critics of the United States, or, internal critics, right, of what's going on in the U.S. or of U.S. war aims or what have you, get called unpatriotic. And I think so the one question I guess I have for you is do you think there's an appropriate American nationalism, or kind of that isn't supremacist? Or
so Nikil, going back to your earlier point about India, this is what you find everywhere authoritarianism rises, is you find attacking education systems as anti-national, in whatever vocabulary people use. Anti-American, anti-Hungarian, Another commonality you see is, in case it doesn't come up, I want to mention it. For some reason, they go after, these authoritarians go after the Nobel Prize winners in literature of the national minority. So Hungary removed Imre Kertész, the only Hungarian post-war Nobel Prize winner in literature, from its national curriculum. He was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, talking about what it's like to be a Jewish Holocaust survivor in Hungary, and pre-war as well. And they removed him from the curriculum and replaced him with two mediocre far-right writers who no one cares about, who Horthy, the quasi-fascist leader, the guy who allied with Hitler, kept on wanting to get them the Nobel Prize in Literature, but they're just like, so that's what we see here. So we see it in India. It's just kind of one of the depressing things is how paint by number this often is. Just like you see state after state passing the same exact bill that probably Alec wrote or something like that, you see country after country adopting the same technique. You're anti-Indian after the Citizenship Amendment Act passed in 2019, the protests in universities, nonviolent protests for Muslim equality. Universities were painted as anti-Indian, and the students, two of the original organizers, are charged with incitement to murder, with attempted murder, incitement to riot, and this is what I needn't mention what is happening with U.S. universities and protests recently. In the case of the United States, my worry, I don't think we're at the point where we can even ask whether there's a kind of healthy American nationalism. I do believe in healthy versions of national. I mean, I don't know. I do know that Tim Snyder and I had a debate in the Yale Political Union, resolved nationalism leads to tyranny, and he wiped the goddamn floor with me because I was saying it does. So I don't want to. So there's a move Snyder makes where you're like, but nationalism leads to this, it leads to patriarchy, it leads to racism, it leads to, and he said, well, maybe racism leads to racism and patriarchy leads to treating women badly. Well, I think it's nationalism that is the, so anyway, there's lots of moves you can make. Nationalism might be, the right kind of national identity might be necessary for the kinds of projects that you do. Like what you're doing is you're constructing in your work an American, caring for other Americans as part of our American identity. Your political work involves, you're a national leader on things like building houses, addressing affordable housing, presumably, and kind of for nationalist reasons, because Americans should have housing, So that's a healthy nationalism. Unfortunately, the nationalism that all of us grew up with looks like exactly the nationalism that the Nazis inherited and built up off of. I remember when I was first in Ukraine in 2017, and I was giving a talk on these issues, and I said, unhealthy versus unhealthy nationalism. And I said, supremacist nationalism would be like when you said your country is the greatest on earth, your country. So Hitler, the Nazis said, Nazi Germany is the successor to Greece and Rome. And I heard that, I think, in school about our founders, So I said this, I was like, supremacist nationalism is when you say your country is the greatest ever. Like, imagine Ukrainians saying their country is the greatest ever. Now they're making a case that they're pretty great. But, and someone raised their hand and said, but your President Obama says that all the time about your country. So we have supremacist American nationalism as our national narrative. And if you're looking at that in the way I do as a philosopher, looking in a sober way at the kind of dangerous nationalisms that prepare a country for fascism, it looks a lot like that.
So even, we should just be cautious, right? Or skeptical even of those claims. Even when they're not made by, when they're not made essentially by the political right? They have... That's what's scary about we talk a lot about the material basis for fascism. Oh, there's a Great Depression, and so there was economic anxiety, but there's also an ideological basis for fascism. And the ideological basis for fascism is laid down by the schools. If the schools are already giving you are the greatest ever, then it's easy to say, oh, our nation is in decline. I want to get to, at some point, get out of this. But before we
haven't we run out of time now? That was a joke. No, that was a joke. That was a joke. That was a joke.
And so you're going to tell us how we get out of this. Just because it, in particular, it appeals to me. You have a chapter on the kind of adoption of classical education, and just to rehearse some things. When I was growing up, one of the big debates was about the canon wars, right? And so one of the questions was, there was maybe, let's say, a side that said we needed a more traditional canon that, what some would argue was too white and male, but and others would want to, modernize it and bring newer authors or neglected authors or authors that, women authors, black authors, into literature, and that the same applied to art history and music and things like that. And so the debate in some ways seems, you might say, people would argue that you shouldn't teach Toni Morrison because you're replacing Milton with Toni Morrison. And that all seems fairly quaint right now, that argument. I mean, right now, we, in your chapter, there's just the wholesale demolition of some of these, these traditions. I mean, one, Milton was banned, was what Paradise Lost was pulled out, one of 150 books pulled out of a public library in Florida. But just what is the, there is this new insistence. I mean, maybe not so new, but on this sort of classical education. And so, what function does that serve in this context?
Great.
And what is it? Like, what are they trying to? Yeah.
And why is Hillsdale College saying, pushing Christian nationalism under the banner of classical education? So, the idea is this attack on classical education, this newfangled LGBT perspectives threaten classical education because classical education supports the nuclear family. Marxism threatens the classical education because Marxism is opposed to the nuclear family. Well, in the symposium, the highest height of love is between an old male teacher and a young boy he's teaching. So, I'm not really sure, classical education is anti-LGBT perspectives. And, secondly, Socrates in the Republic argues that in Callipolis, the ideal city, all children are removed from their families at birth. So this kind of absolute crap that Christian nationalism is classical education, and that these ideas, Martin Luther King had a exam for his social and political philosophy class at Boston University. One of the questions was list the radical ideas in Plato's Republic. So, Plato's Republic has an argument, argues for that both women and men can equally be rulers, because he said, the response to Socrates is, well, they are different natural aptitudes. And Socrates says, well, bald people and people with hair have different natural aptitudes. It doesn't bear on their ability to rule. So Plato argues for female equality. Plato argues that children should be removed from their families at birth, because then if you don't know who your kids are, you'll make sure to take care of everybody. And if young people don't know who their parents are, they'll make sure that all older people are taken care of. So, so it's just bullshit. And so what's going on, all these radical ideas have occurred in the classics. There's a whole bunch of different confusions on this. Another is that, oh my God, black studies and women's studies are challenging the Enlightenment ideals of reason and objectivity, and moral progress and moral personhood. It's all this newfangled stuff. But Herda in the 18th century, Kant's main opponent thought that there was no universal notion of moral personhood. There was no such thing as universal reason, and he used it to argue against colonialism. He said, you can't invade another country to like save them because there's no such thing. They speak a different language. So all these ideas that they're saying come from women's studies and area studies are contemporaneous with the Enlightenment. They're the counter-Enlightenment, the anti-Enlightenment. So it's all bullshit. Because the concepts of classical education, the discussions are much more radical. All sorts of the positions taken on Enlightenment ideals and pro and against are all taken by white men, and so what one worries about. I mean, the Nazis loved classical education. It was funded like physics, but they didn't teach it because of the ideas. They taught it because they wanted to promote white men. They wanted to create this idea of whiteness going from the Third Reich backwards to ancient Greece. All great texts are done by white men. And the Nazis, as George Mosse said, the Nazis in their textbooks represented the greatest Roman emperors as really German. And suggested that, like, really the ancient Greeks were Germans. So that was this kind of whiteness read backwards. And very often what we're getting is whiteness read backwards. The expression classical education, a personalist use of classical education. Classical education used as a method of promoting whiteness.
There's so much more to talk about, and it will get. But I want to make sure that we, and get to our audience. So I think at this point we want to get to questions, and we do have mics or a mic. And so please, if anyone has questions for regarding the book.
Yeah, please just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic. I'll ask you to ask the question into the mic so everyone can hear you.
So the senator asked you, I don't think you answered the question, or we ran out of time or whatever. The question was, how do we get out of this? So so I think that on a national level, people might be aware of the little fascist-like incursions into society. But I don't think that the American public is as aware of those things, or they even care as much about those things when they're on a state level. And the state level is where most of this stuff is happening, right? So what's the answer?
Well, those are different things you're bringing up. But I mean, you're absolutely right that, a state like Tennessee is like basically a fascist state, a one-party state. Like abortion is illegal even in the cases of rape and incest. It's like a Christian nationalist authoritarian state. Contraception is required. Parental consent is required for contraception, 18 and under. And one could go on. So we've let these things happen. There's an online reporting form for professors, so you can report professors who teach divisive concepts. So they narrowly rejected criminal penalties against such professors who taught about white privilege or mortgage redlining. So it's so extreme what's happening now. It's meant to create this culture of authoritarianism where you turn each other in, where you're encouraged to turn each other in. So what do? I think you fight the culture of authoritarianism. You fight the fear. They target teachers, right? They target people who serve on local election boards, and they make their life hell. There's a tendency to want to scurry away when there's this attack. I've seen it happen. Started in the universities. The targeting professors, Turning Points USA, campus reform. They target someone for like a tweet or something, and then they make that person's life like absolute hell. And that's what they're doing on that strategy has gone into the local level. And what we, everywhere, it's, so I think what's vital is the solidarity. Like, someone's being attacked, don't scurry away and say, it's thank God it's not me. Bring them an apple pie. Have someone videotape you, take a video of you bringing them an apple pie and post it on social media. Make it a badge of honor to be hunted out as as someone who pushes for LGBT perspectives to be represented in schools. So support the democratic institutions, teachers' unions. The public schools are being attacked. The public school is central to democracy. That's why it's being attacked. The Freedmen's Bureau created public schools, and Black Americans created public schools in the South because they're central to democracy. That's why they're attacking them. Support unions. Unions are central to democracy. Have solidarity when they try to go after us.
Thanks for coming to Harrisburg. I didn't read your book yet. I just purchased it. Do you think there's a danger in over-focusing on political fascism and political authoritarianism and avoiding talk of economic authoritarianism, economic fascism? I mean, the corporate structure itself is a fascist structure.
Oh, good. Excellent. Now, one thing Timothy Snyder says is, just in conversation, is that the Marxists were wrong about mid-century fascism, but they're right about what we're seeing now. So monopoly capitalism. So what you're saying is, you forgot to mention the role of monopoly capitalism and fascism, which is correct. I'm sorry. I should be, I talk about it in how fascism works more, but it's a central part, as we're seeing. We're seeing the tech billionaires, we're seeing the fossil fuel industry line up behind Trump, because it's a very natural thing. It's the opposite of free market. Even if you're just a straight orthodox capitalist, you should be really opposed to what's happening, which is monopoly capitalism, which is a bunch of super rich people are lining up behind an autocratic leader, hoping to get special deals on cornering the market. So that's what's happening. That's what the Marxists said was happening in 1930s Germany. It's much clearer that it's happening now. It's very clear. It very clearly happened with Putin. Very cleverly used monopoly capitalism to seize Russia. He got the oligarchs behind him, and suddenly the oligarchs found out that, so that's what we're seeing here. It's another paint by numbers thing. It's monopoly capitalism. People are hoping crony capitalism. People are hoping they're going to be able to get the special deals. Trump very clearly in his first term went after firms that, he split up that merger with, I forget Time, and he split up mergers on political reasons. He did DeSantis showing off, went after Disney, so everybody's like, so the monopoly capitalists are like, hey, we can get in with these guys right now. We won't be targeted, and we'll get special deals.
Other questions?
We're up on the gallery for this one.
Great. Okay, cool.
Hi. So kind of going off of your quote, war is won by teachers, fighting the fear. And earlier you answering about, supporting teachers' union, supporting the teachers. As a teacher for U.S. history, what kind of recommendations do you have for us who are kind of on that battlefield? As we kind of move forward through this, kind of war on these topics, as someone who has seen certain topics being removed, even in PA, from my own curriculum, and me trying to have them back? What kind of just advice or recommendations do you have for us?
I'm going to disappoint you, because to me, your question is a little bit like if a Ukrainian soldier asked me, what kind of recommendations do you have for us on the front line? You know, I mean, when the Russians are shooting at me, what does philosophy say we should do? You know, you're on the front lines. So, you know the emails I'm getting from you and your colleagues are things I'm learning from. You know, we have this model of I talk about in the book, the Jarvis Gibbons and Imani Perry's Black Teacher Archives, which is digitalized, where you're really looking at teachers in the black teachers in the Jim Crow South trying to keep the memory of slave rebellions, of black agency and black resistance alive. What to do right now? You're in a moment where we can stop a certain slide. Like recently, you know, I was in Europe over the summer, and in one of my talks, a woman stood up and she's like, I'm Russian and I'm getting my master's here, and then I'm going to go back to Russia. What can I do to stop the authoritarianism in Russia? I said, you could stay the hell away from Russia, because you will be killed if you try to stop the authoritarianism in Russia. So we don't want to get there. We don't want to get to the place where we want to stop it right now, because it slides. Russia is an extreme example, but Hungary, lots of examples now where you can be, you know, you're going to be in the political crosshairs. And we already are. You already are in the political crosshairs. So, you know, you're a frontline soldier, and you guys, what's crucial, I think, you know, this is why Tim Snyder's On Tyranny is so useful, because it's all about what you're supposed to do. So chapter 1 is anticipatory obedience. So don't start changing your curriculum in advance before you have to. Yale, my own institution, is like, you know, it's like almost like textbook anticipatory obedience for reasons that I won't go into because they pay my salary. But, you know, there are professors who are trying to fight back on that. So anticipatory obedience, but I feel terribly telling you, a U.S. history teacher, like, you should not get, you know, I mean, you're going to, just by the very fact you're here suggests, you know, you're trying to figure out what to do on, but, you know, God bless you.
Hello. So the question I had is just from like the last 10 years, the conversation between patriotism versus nationalism has come up quite a lot. So my question for you is, why should we lean towards a more healthier version, which I think needs to be explored a little bit more, of nationalism versus patriotism? Like, what would be the difference for you, and why go towards nationalism instead?
Good. I mean, this is a much vexed, you know, like, is there acceptable patriotisms? I don't myself, I mean, you know, some people would say, yeah, it's sort of definitional. Like, you could say you could be you could be patriotic about the ideals of your nation, you know, like democracy or something. But I don't, the problem I have is that the resonances of the term patriotism tend to be pretty authoritarian. Probably the resonances of nationalism too, but nationalism historically emerges as a response to monarchy. So it's not like by definition, you know, it's, you know, it used to be all kings and queens, right? And it wasn't like the Habsburg emperor and, you know, the British the British king, their children would marry, and so nationalism comes in the 19th century, and it was actually a movement, you know, that involved undermining monarchy. So, and nationalism, you know, try telling, like, there are portions of the world where it has a different valence. Think of, I mean, BJP has done heroic work on turning it from a good valence to a bad valence. But in Africa, African nationalism generally as a good valence, right? So, no one's like, oh, the terrible African nationalism, So, so whereas, patriotism, I'm not convinced there's I don't know what the core of patriotism is supposed to mean. If it means idolatry of symbols, then it's problematic. And it often seems to mean idolatry of symbols.
I have a question really quick, which I want to ask because there's sort of a debate happening on our YouTube live stream of this event. And it's sort of a devil's advocate question, because I think here in central Pennsylvania, we all interact with people in our friend groups and our families who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum. And these events, as much as the issue of, anti-fascism should be nonpartisan, often are not. Often we do have these conversations in something of an echo chamber. And we're sitting here talking about, I think, right-wing authoritarian movements pretty heavily, but people wanting to debate this issue and wanting to erase history and rewrite it often say that the other side of the aisle is doing the exact same thing, saying that communism is trying to take over, all of our systems, all of that. So how do you approach that question, that accusation, that issue, especially with people who, we all know and we love them and we just want them to see sense?
Yeah, so I have all my living relatives are Orthodox Jews and Trump supporters, but I know why they're Trump supporters, because he's going to deliver for Orthodox Jews, like he's going to allow the religious schools to remain not having to have standards so people learn to read, things like that. So getting it done for your community, like religious communities might see the abortion agenda in a certain way. But there's a puzzle, right? The Nazis won by saying the same thing that the MAGA Republicans are saying now. But the Nazis were right. There were actual communists. There were Stalinists. There were scary communists. I mean, I'm not a communist. I'm a social democrat, but I'm not a communist. I mean, there were scary communists, and Goebbels was correct when he talked about that they were existential threats to religion, and Stalin did terrible, it was an existential, Stalinism was a threat to religious freedom. But now there are no communists. So what the hell is going on? Because there's not people going around, we're going to forcibly take the Christians and force them to be atheists. That's not happening. It's not, we don't have people saying we're going to mass execute, we're going to all live miserable lives. So in the future, it's in communism, everybody's miserable, fascism, some people are happy, other people are miserable, really miserable. In communism, it kind of sucks for everybody. That's just not happening. But what they're doing is they're saying that they're painting people, they're painting a neoliberal like Barack Obama, who restocked all the banks after the financial crisis with trillions of dollars. They're saying he's a Marxist. Who had Arnie Duncan as his Secretary of Education, who had Tim Geithner as his Secretary of Rahm Emanuel was his Chief of Staff, and he's a Marxist. So what they're saying is even neoliberal centrists who are not supporters of Donald Trump are Marxists and communists. And it's ludicrous. And so it's just a mystery to me how you're going to take, how are you supposed to respond when you're saying that? I mean, the Nazis did some of this, right? They did a lot of this. They said everyone who isn't a Nazi is a communist. So, they did that too. But there were communists. So you could be like, oh, look, those scary people, they're like them. But now there are no communists. There's some people there's always been people policing speech more than they should or whatever. Yeah, sometimes you'll get socially shunned if you do things. That's probably been true forever as well. Do those social mechanisms exaggerate? Are there bad uses of them? Sure there are. That's probably always been true as well. But communism, like taking it over, closing the churches, making sure that everyone is the same level of relative poverty, that's just not happening. So it's another one of these, dual reality things. Barack Obama's not a communist. Timothy Geithner was the head of Goldman Sachs. He's not a communist. He was a Secretary of Treasury under Barack Obama. So how do you argue with people who say the CEO, the head of Goldman Sachs, is a communist because he served in a communist? It's kind of I don't know how to react. Because there's no, which is not to say that there aren't, like my Orthodox Jew, I have many more Trump supporters in my family than, like almost everyone is a Trump supporter. And we love it. When we're together, they argue with me sometimes, but they're not Trump supporters because they think there's communists like running, or Stalinists running around. They just have particular interests that, Trump is delivering for certain right-wing interests. Among them, deeply socially conservative, religious people like my family.
I'm glad you are as mystified by it as I am. We do have time for one or two more questions.
When I look at what you're saying, I really look at structural problems that cause divisiveness, because when it comes down to it, it's people have different ideas about things go. And right now we're in a presidential election cycle. Well, we're going to go through that and we're going to be partisan, because that's what you do. You vote against the other side. Well, as soon as that's over, we're into a midterm election cycle. You do the same thing. No sooner do you get into the midterm election cycle, what happens? The next presidential election cycle comes up. So there is a structural thing which says we are going to be hyper-partisan almost every month or every year. So what is really, the idea is what's really keeping us from our hyper-partisanship? And as you know, you're out there in academia, and as everybody else knows, you've got 24-hour news, and you also have the internet and a blogosphere. So all these things have put us on edge every single point, and guess what doesn't happen? It's called governance. We're running for office, but we're not legislating in office. Thank you.
So, yeah, legislatures are pretty dysfunctional. That's right. No, I mean, at the federal level. At the federal level, he's not. He gets it done. Well, that's what's so impressive about you is, and politicians like you who are actually using government to get things done for the good, which is like actually supposed to be the idea of a state. Like we have so. Abstracting from the weird MAGA Republican structure we have now, which actually is very pro-state, like Ron DeSantis is going to use, they're going to use the state to go after schools. They're using the state to go after Disney. They're definitely using the state, right? So that's like not what I'm going to talk about. The anti-state, the sort of Reagan legacy of Reagan, libertarianism. They want to say the state, they want to destroy the power of the state. They want to say states can't work for you. That's the old school stuff, the old school sort of, from the 80s, 90s. But so the work you're doing is showing that states can function, and that sort of idealism is what we need in politics. we need people who want to work together to make things function. And I think you can actually have some overlap on goals. Like some of the MAGA Republicans are sometimes populist, genuinely populist. Like I think J.D. Vance did co-sign legislation with Elizabeth Warren. So, those are ways, he's also Peter Thiel's protege, so it's hard to make sense of. But you can have some overlaps. Like if you're going to be serious about the populism, let's do something for working. Let's do something about the finance industry together. So those are ways to we have now democratic socialists, we have national conservatives. There could be some possibility of overlap if we had some seriousness about the populist aspect. However, I'm very pro hyper-partisanship. Just as a thought experiment, would you be hyper-partisan in the 1932 German elections? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, right. So you really sometimes have to be hyper-partisan, and it was very similar there. Like suddenly people's friends were like, I like Hitler. Like he's getting, don't pay attention to the rhetoric. He's going to get it done. And Victor Klemperer and his language of the Third Reich, he talks about this. Like I rented to a student, he was a friend of mine. Klemperer was Jewish, and he kept on saying, oh no, and this friend of mine just like, no, Hitler doesn't mean it about the Jews. And, sometimes you have to be hyper-partisan. And unfortunately, as we have, the unhelpful but accurate political science expression, asymmetric polarization, where on the one hand you have the center-centrists, like, I guess, Clinton's, Obama, Clinton's, maybe Kamala, we don't really know. And then the far right who want to make it illegal to teach LGBT perspectives in schools and, do blanket bans on abortion and go after, replace secular education by Christian nationalism. I think you probably have to be partisan in those moments.
And this will be our last question.
How you doing, Professor Stanley? Thanks for being here. So I might ask two things. You can choose which one you want to respond to. The first is reading the book. I couldn't help thinking about the 7 mountain mandates that's not in the book. So if you can respond to that, talk about that a little bit. And
that's
maybe
the Christian nationalist aspect?
Yeah. And why that's not included.
Dominious. Because it was a mistake. My agent told me to include it. She was right. Okay. Yeah.
Well, the other one was...
Dominionism.
Okay.
Right. Dominionism, yeah. Mm-hmm. Dominionism should be... I'm focusing more on... It's a great question and vital point. What we're facing is... a theocracy, and explicit theocracy. And then we have cynical figures like Trump and I think DeSantis, who, just want to be autocrats, and they're going to bring in the theocrats to support them. So I think that's what's going on. But the specific thing we face is theocracy. Yeah.
Well, thank you. The second question I was going to ask, and maybe you can leave us on a positive note, see the light at the end of the tunnel. We've been here before in the 20s, the 50s, the 70s, early 2000s, and here we are. So looking back at history, do you see the light at the end of the tunnel where things start to, the pendulum swings back again?
Totally. I think that the history of authoritarianism is so long democracy is very rare, and you're always going to have to fight to preserve democracy, because people are kind of often natural followers of authority. So, I mean, we can go and delve into why that is. The literature suggests it does have to do with the nuclear family. That if you're raised in a, not nuclear, but if you're raised in a patriarchal family, you have a greater tendency to accept or go for authoritarianism over democracy. That's why, with my kids, unfortunately, I always engage their reasoning faculties. And so, and it takes a lot longer to get to a restaurant. But you're supposed to do that. So I think democracy is really hard. Here's the good news. I think it's always going to be like this. So, probably always has been. The 90s, the very idea that the 90s were so great is a very white thing in the United States. They were horrors, the 90s, the Clintons in the 90s, the crime bill, 100-to-1 crack. I mean, it was a very brutal time of racism and mass, crime is dropping, incarceration is shooting up. So things always suck for a lot of people. What we need is, it looks like economic inequality, as the standard theories of fascism would have it, is a serious driver of, say, stereotypes, negative stereotypes, so dealing with these structural issues, I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a very powerful thing. It's like an anti-fascist FDR kind of thing, where you're bringing material support to communities who might be inclined to support fascism, support authoritarianism. So look at Biden. I mean, I think Biden, Occupy Wall Street. Look at you. Look at politicians like you. They didn't exist in 2011. It was all the Democrats and Republicans both are for privatizing everything, and now we have Democratic Socialists, So Occupy Wall Street, people are saying, it didn't really work. Yes, it did. With downstream effects. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, we have grumpy old senators who are definitely not corrupt. So we have movements of people. Biden administration was an administration where they were redistributing. I think it's the first administration in decades where there was redistribution. So there's always redistribution. It's just usually from the bottom up, but it was redistribution in the other direction under Biden. So, I think, the emergence of democratic socialists who want to focus on making our material lives better, affordable housing, creating maybe different models of policing, not defunding the police, but, having police be restructured so they're not militarized. I think these are all, a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash to that. But maybe we can work together on some issues. If the MAGA Republicans are serious about helping working families, then maybe we can, I don't think they're serious about it, but maybe, so we have a sort of breaking up of the traditional neoliberal, different versions of neoliberalism. And I think there's hope there.
All right, with that,
No,
anything you wanted to add?
I was just going to say there's hope, right? And so I was just going to echo that, and I just was hoping to ask the audience again to thank and Jason Stanley and thank you for coming and presenting this book. It's great to have you. Thank you.